Hey guys, tonight we drift into the Egyptian dusk, that sacred hour when gold melts into violet and the heat exhales into silence. You're standing at the very edge of the desert, toes sinking into sand that still clings to the memory of the Sunday. The day's fire is fading, yet the ground still hums softly with its ghost. Above you, the sky unfolds like indigo silk, scattered with stars so sharp they could cut through the dark. It's breathtaking, but it's also dangerous. Because here in Egypt, when the sun goes down, the world doesn't just rest, it shifts. The air cools, the wind changes voice, and even the rules of survival begin to rewrite themselves. And that's where our story begins, with the paradox that built a civilization. Days that could burn you alive, and nights that could freeze you solid. It's the New Kingdom, around 1550 to 1070 BCE, when Egypt was at its height, its pharaohs rich with gold and gods, its artisans carving eternity into stone, its cities thriving along the Nile. In places like Thebes, Luxor, and the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, people mastered the art of living between extremes. They built homes that could breathe, temples that could outlast time, and a way of life that balanced comfort and devotion like two halves of a single prayer. If you've ever stood in a desert at sunset, you know that instant, that sudden drop, like the land inhaling all at once. One moment you're squinting against the glare, the next you're pulling your robe tight, wondering how the same sand could turn from fire to frost in a breath. The Egyptians didn't have central heating or wool blankets or even fireplaces in their homes, yet they survived here for thousands of years, sleeping peacefully under the same stars that shiver above us now. So tonight, we're going to learn how they did it, how the ancient Egyptians slept through the desert cold without a single spark of fire. Before we start, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim your lights. Maybe you've got a blanket, a soft pillow, or just the steady hum of your own quiet room. You don't need to be in a temple or a tomb to feel the calm of ancient Egypt. You just need to listen. Because Egypt, at its heart, was never just a place of heat and stone. It was a world of balance. The ancient Egyptians were, above all, masters of adaptation. They didn't fight their environment, they befriended it. The Nile gave them life. The desert guarded them from enemies. And the sun, for all its cruelty, became their greatest clock, god, and teacher. In the rhythm of heat and coolness, they discovered something most civilizations spend centuries chasing: equilibrium. They called it Ma'at, the cosmic law of balance. Everything in the Egyptian world was built upon it: the flow of the river, the rise and fall of the sun, the weighing of the soul in the afterlife, even the architecture of their homes. Ma'at was harmony between light and dark, chaos and order, life and death, and in a way, even between day's fire and night's chill. Imagine this. The houses of the ancient Egyptians were not grand palaces of comfort. Most were small, built of sun-dried mud brick, packed close together like clay beehives along the Nile. The walls were thick, not to keep out cold, but to trap the day's warmth, storing sunlight like a battery of earth. When night came, that heat whispered back into the rooms, just enough to keep you alive, not enough to make you sweat. No hearth, no chimney, no smoke, just the steady heartbeat of nature answering itself. The Egyptian night was never silent. The desert has its own sounds: the hiss of wind through reeds, the creak of rope against wood, the far-off cry of a jackal that may or may not be human imagination. Inside the homes it was quieter. The faint rustle of linen, the sigh of sleeping children, the soft pop of cooling mud in the walls. Even sound seemed to obey Ma'at, everything in measured rhythm. Never too much, never too little. And maybe that's what makes Egypt so hypnotic, even now. It's not just the monuments or the myths. It's the serenity behind them. The people who built the pyramids didn't see themselves as fighting the desert. They saw themselves as working alongside it. They understood that warmth could be made from earth and air, from fabric and body, from faith and design. To sleep here meant surrender, but not to discomfort. It meant trusting the world to hold you in balance. The paradox of Egypt wasn't just about temperature, it was about philosophy. They lived in a landscape that could kill them in hours, yet they built eternity out of it. They slept beneath the same stars that guided their gods. And in the stillness, between heat and cold, between breath and silence, they found comfort. We like to imagine the ancient world as brutal and primitive, but sometimes it was simply wise in ways we've forgotten. The Egyptians didn't need fire to stay warm. They used design, ritual, and instinct. Their houses breathed with them. Their linens insulated them. Their families slept close, not just for love, but for survival. Warmth was not a resource. It was a relationship. So, as we settle into tonight's story, remember, this isn't about technology or luxury. It's about rhythm. The rhythm of a people who mastered the art of coexistence with their gods, their river, their desert, and their own vulnerability. When you look at a mud brick wall from ancient Thebes, or a simple papyrus mat preserved in the sand, you're looking at the result of centuries of quiet intelligence. Everything they touched was guided by Ma'at, not to conquer the elements, but to cooperate with them. Their balance wasn't perfect, but it was lasting. That's why 5,000 years later we can still feel it in the geometry of their temples, the posture of their statues, the hush of their tombs. It's a balance that hums like the low wind across the dunes. Steady, endless, patient. And tonight, you get to listen to it. So, breathe. Let your shoulders drop. Imagine the desert around you cooling, the air thinning into a silver quiet. Picture the Nile's reflection trembling under the moon. This is where the Egyptians slept, not beneath blankets of flame, but beneath a philosophy of peace. Warmth for them wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. It came from harmony with earth, with home, with one another. And as the stars begin to thicken above the black horizon, we'll follow them into that balance, into the world of mud brick walls, linen sheets, and the ancient wisdom of sleeping without fire. When the desert finally falls quiet, Egypt exhales. The last of the heat slips upward into the black sky, and what's left behind is stillness, the kind that hums in your ears. Somewhere, a donkey brays once, offended by the cold, and then even that sound fades. The night becomes a thin, shimmering sheet of air. This is the hour when ancient Egyptians began their slow retreat indoors, each one passing through doorways that seemed to swallow the day's light. To the untrained eye, those houses looked simple, a few blocks of mud brick stacked without elegance, plastered smooth by straw and time. But step inside, and you'd discover something else entirely. These were not crude huts. They were machines, slow, silent machines that stored warmth, traded air, and measured comfort like an equation written in clay. The genius of it began with the mud brick. Made from nothing more than Nile mud, chopped straw, and persistence, the humble brick was Egypt's first act of engineering empathy. It didn't fight the climate, it cooperated. When the sun beat down, those thick walls absorbed its fury, holding the heat deep within their bellies. And when darkness came, when the wind rolled off the desert in long, invisible waves, the bricks began to whisper that heat back into the room, one soft breath at a time. You could say every Egyptian wall was a kind of battery charged by day, discharged by night, except they didn't need copper wires or solar panels, only time and mud. Modern architects now call this thermal mass. The Egyptians called it good sense. Inside, the air was cooler than you expected, even in late afternoon. A mud brick home did what even Pharaoh's gold couldn't. It kept balance, and balance was sacred. Ma'at, the principle that ruled the universe, was baked into every wall, quite literally, since the mud that built them came from the river that defined their lives. If you touched those walls after sunset, you'd feel the memory of the sun still there, humming like a pulse behind the plaster. The heat didn't burn, it soothed, a slow animal warmth that invited sleep, or at least forgiveness. And the walls were thick, sometimes half a meter or more. The ceilings low. You couldn't stride around dramatically like in a movie set. You had to stoop, bowing almost without realizing, which may have been part of the charm. Humility by architecture, a reminder that even in your own home, you were only a guest of nature. But walls alone weren't enough. Egypt's builders understood that heat rises, and cold, too, has its habits. So they invented roofs that were more philosophy than structure. Each one was a small triumph of recycled material. Palm trunks laid side by side for beams, palm fronds woven across them like giant mats, and then a thick topping of mud and clay to seal it all. It was flexible enough to bend in the wind, porous enough to breathe, and heavy enough to remember the Sunday. During the day, that roof became a barrier, an umbrella against punishment. But at night, it turned into an insulator, a quiet blanket holding warmth inside. Sometimes families would climb up and sleep on top during the hot season, feeling the night breeze slide between the stars. Other times, they huddled below, trusting the same roof to keep the cold at bay. The same structure, two opposite comforts depending only on season, moon, and mood. Below their feet, the story continued. The floors were not mere dirt. Egyptians understood ground temperature better than most modern builders. They would tamp the earth into solid, level surfaces, sometimes mixed with ash or pottery dust to keep insects away. In colder months, families dug shallow hollows in the sand-warm pockets that cradled the body like a cupped hand, storing a little of the day's heat under a thin layer of linen. Others built low platforms from mud brick or woven reeds, raising their beds just high enough to dodge scorpions and drafts. The higher you slept, the cleaner the air, and the less likely you were to wake with something crawling across your ankle. Not that Egyptians minded small creatures much. Most were treated as neighbors rather than pests. But still, one preferred a polite distance. The house itself became a living organism. The bricks were its bones, the roof its skin, and between them the air flowed like breath. That's where the third secret came in ventilation. Egyptians were masters of what modern architects call passive airflow. They didn't have fans or vents, but they had the Nile wind. It came predictably from the north, reliable as a god, and they built their homes to greet it. Narrow slits were carved high on the walls, facing the wind's direction. During the day, they let in cool air. At night, they let the house sigh out its warmth. The shape of the slit mattered wider outside. narrow inside a primitive pressure valve designed centuries before the concept of aerodynamics existed. Sometimes, they covered the openings with reed blinds or woven mats soaked in water. As air passed through, it cooled slightly, perfuming the house with the faint scent of papyrus. In summer, that made the difference between rest and delirium. In winter, the mats were hung dry not to cool the air but to slow the drafts, turning the wind into a soft murmur rather than a knife. There was a poetry to this precision. Nothing wasted, nothing fought. The Egyptians didn't try to dominate their environment. They listened to it. Every choice, the mud brick, the palm beam, the low ceiling, the narrow window, was a conversation between human need and desert logic. Even the sunlight was part of the plan. Because Egypt didn't have glass, most homes had few openings, just enough to let in the morning glow, never enough to invite the afternoon blaze. Light spilled in thin golden bands across the floor, catching dust motes like stars adrift in a smaller sky. By nightfall, that same light turned to warmth, trapped gently in the bricks. If you're imagining something dark or gloomy, think again. Egyptian homes weren't oppressive caves. They were calm, filtered worlds, like the inside of an eggshell. The air stayed clean. The smell, a mix of clay, oil, and reed, was the smell of safety. Sometimes, in richer households, the plaster walls were whitewashed to reflect light, making rooms brighter by day and slightly warmer by night. The effect was subtle but noticeable. The surface bounced warmth back into the room instead of letting it escape. Limestone and gypsum paints weren't decoration. They were early climate technology, disguised as beauty. And when the evening came, when families settled in to sleep, the heat of those walls made a difference you could feel. You might still shiver once or twice as the air thinned, but the cold never truly bit. The mud brick remembered your day for you. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the house breathing the expansion of cooling clay, the soft drip of condensed air on reed, the faint shifting of sand beneath. These were not the sterile homes of modernity. They were alive in ways we've mostly forgotten. And of course there was humor even in this. Egyptians were nothing if not practical comedians. One papyrus fragment jokes that a wise man builds his wall thick enough to hide from his wife's mother. Another advises that if your roof leaks, praise the Nile, at least your floor will not crack. They laughed at discomfort because they understood it. In the rhythm of the desert, even inconvenience had a place. Their architecture was honest, no false promises of luxury, just the quiet competence of survival. Perfect, that's a smart pacing strategy. As the night deepens, you begin to understand that these houses were not built against the desert, but with it. They didn't try to erase its moods, they adapted to them like an old friend whose temper you'd long ago learned to navigate. Each wall, each corner, was a small agreement between human comfort and natural law. The Egyptians knew that warmth was not about excess. Too much of it, and your house became a kiln. Too little, and you'd freeze before dawn. The solution was moderation, the kind that philosophers later wrote about, but farmers had already mastered. In villages along the Nile, mud brick homes grew in clusters, their walls pressed shoulder to shoulder. The closeness wasn't only social, it was thermal. Houses borrowed heat from each other, like neighbors sharing gossip. A single wall might serve two families, holding the day's warmth twice as long. From above, the settlements must have looked like small fortresses of reason, their roofs almost touching, their shadows merging into one calm geometry. At night, the temperature could drop by more than 20 degrees. But inside, Beneath low ceilings and compact rooms, that drop slowed to a whisper. The air cooled gently, never sharply. Sleep came without the shock of cold breath. Some rooms were designed specifically for that transition. Archaeologists call them cooling chambers or sleeping halls, though the ancient term is lost. They were small, windowless spaces, often located at the heart of the house. In summer, they offered shade. In winter, insulation. The logic was elegant. The farther you went from the outer walls, the more stable the temperature became. Egyptian builders didn't need thermometers to know this. They learned it by sitting still. Observation was their laboratory. If the mud stayed damp longest in the corner, that's where you built your pantry. If the cat liked sleeping near the west wall, that's where you'd rest your child. Their architecture was not calculated, it was listened into existence. The roofs, meanwhile, carried another secret. Their layers of palm and clay weren't just insulation. They were instruments. On windy nights, they made a faint rustling sound, like fabric shifting above your head. It was the sound of survival proof that the house was alive and adjusting. People said the roof whispered when it was pleased, creaked when it was hungry for repair, and fell silent only when the gods themselves were listening. If you'd climbed one of those roofs in the cold season, you might have found something unexpected. Pottery jars filled with sand. During the day, the jars absorbed heat from the sun. At night, they radiated it back into the air, an early version of thermal storage, disguised as decoration. The Egyptians didn't write engineering manuals, but their cities were full of experiments that worked perfectly by intuition. The floors, too, were works of quiet ingenuity, sometimes made from compacted clay, sometimes from stone. They served as the house's lungs. Their density kept out moisture, but their pores allowed a subtle exchange of temperature. To the Egyptian mind, breath and heat were related, both signs of life. Even the earth beneath your feet had to breathe with you. In wealthier homes, the floors were covered with mats woven from palm fiber, rush, or flax, soft enough for bare feet, coarse enough to remind you that luxury was temporary. The mats trapped a layer of air between body and ground, creating warmth without weight. At night, families unrolled additional layers, not blankets exactly, but thick linens folded and refolded through years of use. The scent of these fabrics, smoke, sweat, and desert wind, was the smell of continuity. Sometimes the family dog curled against the mat's edge, adding its small furnace of body heat. Children nestled close. Parents wrapped an arm or leg across whoever shivered first. The warmth was communal, not individual. In Egypt, heat was something you shared. Even the poorest houses practiced this kind of generosity. A widow sleeping alone might have her neighbor's child sent to keep her company on cold nights. It wasn't charity, it was wisdom. One more heartbeat in the room meant one more degree of warmth. The same principle shaped community life. Villages were built close to the river, where humidity softened the air. Streets were narrow by design, shaded by overhanging roofs. The alleys funneled wind in summer and held it still in winter. Every path, every wall, every corner an orchestra of airflow, composed over generations. And then there was light, that other form of warmth. Egyptians treated it like a liquid. They poured it carefully into rooms through high slits, letting it trickle down the walls instead of flooding the space. This wasn't just aesthetic restraint, it was climate control. The light warmed surfaces but not air, keeping the room cozy without stifling it. At sunset, the light drained away slowly, and the walls began their second performance, releasing what they had absorbed. The glow of dusk gave way to a deeper warmth that felt almost emotional. One writer from the New Kingdom described it perfectly. When the sun leaves, the house remembers. He might have meant love, but he was also describing physics. The walls were storytellers. They remembered heat, breath, laughter, the faint scent of stew. Every surface carried yesterday forward. That's why Egyptians repainted their homes so often, not because they were vain, but because color sealed the memory of warmth. Fresh plaster meant a new layer of life. In the corner of one excavated house in Deir el-Medina, archaeologists found a niche lined with fragments of broken pots. At first, they assumed it was trash storage. Later, they realized the pottery had been placed deliberately. The porous shards acted as tiny insulators, trapping air and moisture that moderated temperature. Someone, 3,000 years ago, had invented eco-friendly insulation by breaking a jar and thinking about it. If you walked through that same neighborhood at night, you'd hear an entire city breathing in rhythm, soft cracks of cooling mud, distant coughs, muted laughter. The houses absorbed and exhaled heat together, a chorus of low energy and high cooperation. In modern terms, we might call it sustainable design. In their terms, it was just living correctly. Even the layout of Egyptian homes reflected this philosophy. Most had a central room where the family gathered, and smaller chambers branching from it. The central space was often slightly higher, a pocket where warm air collected. In colder months, families dragged their mats there to sleep together, letting the air's gentle gradient do its work. No fire, no smoke, no risk. Just architecture performing its quiet miracle. Of course, there were dangers. When rare cold snaps swept through the valley, frost could form on open ground. Those nights demanded strategy. People sealed doors with woven cloths dipped in oil to block drafts. They burned incense in the courtyards not for heat, but to trick the senses, to make the air feel warmer through scent and movement. The mind, they knew, was half the battle. And always, the mud brick stood patient. It didn't complain, didn't crack, just waited for the next sunrise. The bricks had seen everything: floods, droughts, arguments about goats. They had held centuries of families against their sides. No wonder the Egyptians considered clay sacred. It was earth made loyal. They even carried that reverence into religion. In the Book of the Dead, the god Khnum is said to have shaped humans from Nile clay on his potter's wheel. The metaphor wasn't lost on them. If humans came from mud, then walls made of mud were kin, not objects. The house wasn't shelter, it was relative. You respected it, and it respected you back. There's a kind of quiet comedy in how well it all worked. Imagine an empire that could mummify a body for eternity, but still kept its citizens warm using mud and patience. That's Egypt grandeur built on restraint. Meanwhile, outside, the desert played its part. By midnight, the sand had cooled enough to glow silver. The stars felt close enough to touch. The cold brushed across rooftops like invisible water. But inside, the family slept, their breathing syncing with the slow pulse of their homes. If you could stand there, unseen, listening, you'd understand what comfort meant before technology. No humming machines, no electric flicker, just the physics of clay and trust. In the morning, when the first light slipped through the slits, the warmth reversed again, the walls drinking in the sun, while the air still held the cool of night. The house was always in dialogue with itself. There was no on or off, no season switch, just balance, eternal and ordinary. That balance is the true secret of Egyptian longevity. Empires crumble when they overheat politically or literally. Egypt survived because it stayed temperate in body and in spirit. And maybe that's the humor at the heart of all this. We moderns, armed with thermostats and theories, still chase comfort as if it were a prize. The Egyptians achieved it with mud, mathless, and melody. If you listen closely to the faint hiss of sand, the weight of silence pressing against the door, you can almost hear the lesson they left behind. Warmth is not conquered. It is cultivated. The same earth that could bury you could also cradle you. You only needed to know how to listen to it. And that is how the ancient Egyptians, under roofs of palm and ceilings of clay, slept through the desert cold without a single spark of fire and without a single worry. The longer you stay in that Egyptian night, the more it feels alive. The walls don't merely stand. They listen. They absorb every sound, a baby's sigh, the click of pottery cooling, the distant thrum of a donkey shifting in its sleep, and folded into their stillness. The mud brick was more than shelter. It was memory hardened by heat, the earth's diary written without ink. A traveler passing through might mistake the silence for emptiness, but Egypt's quiet was never empty. It was full of agreement between wind and wall, between man and season, between the pulse of the desert and the patience of design. No flame burned here, yet everything glowed. If you stepped outside, the air would startle you. The cold of the desert is a living thing, a cat of silver fur brushing against your ankles, then vanishing when you try to name it. But even out there, the villages radiated warmth like low embers. Not the warmth of fire, but of continuity. Every house in that labyrinth of clay gave back a little of what it had taken in the day. The alleys shimmered faintly with residual heat. The air smelled faintly of river dust and flax. The night itself seemed to hum with moderation, as though even the stars had learned not to burn too fiercely. The roofs were a second landscape. Families sometimes climbed up to sleep there during warmer seasons. Whole households laid out beneath a ceiling of constellations that never quite kept still. The Milky Way stretched like spilled flour, and if you were a child lying on your back, you might think that Ra himself had left a trail of light while sailing into the underworld. Up there, the air was cooler, but not cruel. The body adjusted. The sky's cold met the skin's stored heat, and a truce was struck. Parents told stories to soften that cold, fables of foxes and gods, of clever servants who outwitted priests, of the day when the Nile first learned to sing. The tales slowed the breath, lulled the limbs, reminded listeners that nothing in nature rushed. Sleep was not a surrender, but a return to order. Down below, a potter's workshop still held the faint heat of its daytime kiln. The workers often left the kiln sealed, but glowing through the night, its bricks radiating a small warmth that leaked through the adjoining walls. Children would press their palms against the outer clay and giggle at the miracle, a wall that pulsed like a heartbeat. The potter knew it too, he just called it good masonry. In wealthier homes, small earthen braziers existed, but rarely burned. They were symbols more than tools, clay bowls lined with ash, holding perhaps a single coal on the coldest nights. The Egyptians feared fire's greed. It consumed without remorse, so they let it die early, trusting the mud brick to finish the job more gently. The last glow was always covered with sand, like a secret being tucked in. Inside, the air smelled faintly of oil and baked clay. Linen rustled like a whisper. Somewhere in the corner, a cat turned twice before settling. That sound, a soft thump of fur meeting mat, was the punctuation mark of Egyptian peace. The family breathed in unison now. The father's chest rose. The child's followed. The mother's matched the rhythm. The house exhaled through its pores. You could almost believe the whole structure inhaled with them, walls flexing imperceptibly under the pressure of breath. In this way, the building was part of the family, a fifth sleeper, ancient and patient. Archaeologists studying those homes centuries later still find evidence of that cooperation. Thin layers of soot show where oil lamps once flickered, not for heat, but for ritual. Beneath the soot lies plaster mixed with straw, plant fibers chosen precisely for their ability to expand and contract with temperature. The science of empathy built right into the wall. Even the color of the walls mattered. Lighter pigments reflected heat in summer. Darker ones stored it in winter. Some homes bore painted borders near the floor, a faded red line that once trapped sunlight like a seam. The Egyptians may not have known the word infrared, but they certainly knew what it did. Every element carried dual purpose. A jar stored grain by day and warmth by night. A wooden door, rough and uneven, acted as a barrier to wind, yet leaked just enough air to keep the room from stagnating. A curtain woven from reeds hummed softly when the air shifted, an early warning of weather change. The home was not static, it responded. In the darkest hour before dawn, when the desert cold reached its sharpest, the family stirred slightly under their linens. A cough here, a sigh there, perhaps the quiet mutter of someone dreaming of Sunday. The walls waited. They did what they always did. Released the last of the day's stored heat in long invisible waves. The process was slow, rhythmic, the architectural equivalent of a lullaby. That warmth reached the sleepers without sound or smoke. It crept into limbs, softened breath, convinced the body that the world was still kind. There is genius in that kind of invisible care, comfort that never announces itself. In later centuries, Roman engineers would boast of heated floors and marble baths. They mistook noise for progress. The Egyptians had already achieved the same result centuries earlier with quiet mud. Outside, the sand hissed faintly as the temperature shifted again. The stars dimmed a little. Somewhere far off, the Nile made its soft applause against the banks, the river's way of marking another successful night of equilibrium. The farmer who would soon rise to check his nets didn't worry about his house. He trusted it the way one trusts a friend's silence. It had seen too many winters to fail him now, and when he finally stood, stretching his back against the chill, he felt the floor's gentle warmth under his feet. Not much, just enough. That was Egypt's way. Enough was perfect. He poured a small measure of oil into a lamp and lit it briefly, not to banish the dark, but to greet it. The flame wavered, painted the room gold, and then he pinched it out again. The walls glowed faintly from memory. That single spark had done its duty, light without fire, warmth without waste. If you could speak to him in that moment, he might shrug and say, "The house remembers." And you'd believe him. Because it did. Each wall knew its story. The storms it had endured, the hands that had shaped it, the children who had leaned against it to learn their first words. The house carried those layers like sediment, warmth accumulating not just from sunlight but from usefulness. Even ruin didn't end that memory. When archaeologists dig through collapsed walls, they find layers of plaster still holding traces of heat-altered minerals, scientific proof that mud once glowed with stored energy. The earth never forgets warmth given in trust. And that, perhaps, is the true moral hidden in all those bricks and mats and silent rooms. The difference between fire and heat, between possession and companionship. Fire devours, heat lingers. Fire demands, heat returns. The Egyptians chose the latter, and the proof still sleeps under the sand. If you close your eyes now and imagine yourself lying on one of those papyrus mats, you can almost feel the texture slightly scratchy, faintly fragrant with smoke and Nile mud. The pillow beneath your neck is a curve of polished wood, cool at first, then warm as skin meets grain. Outside, the wind sighs against the door. The air smells faintly of clay, milk, and river reeds. You are neither hot nor cold. You are balanced exactly as Egypt intended. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster tests the idea of morning. The sky answers in violet. The temperature shifts by one invisible degree. The first light slides down the wall, touches the painted border, and the house inhales once more. The cycle begins again. And you realize maybe warmth isn't the opposite of cold at all. Maybe it's just understanding. When the last lamp dimmed and the dogs outside stopped barking at nothing, Egyptian night began not in darkness, but in gathering warmth. The kind that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with people. Inside a single-room house, a family drew close. There was no central hearth, no chimney glowing with orange promise. Instead, there was a tangle of limbs, mats, and small bodies curled toward one another. A mother pulled her youngest nearer. An older child rolled against the family dog, and a father exhaled into the hollow of the air that hung between them. The heat they made together was small, but constant, an invisible hearth built from breathing. To modern ears, it sounds precarious. To the Egyptians, it was wisdom. They knew that body heat multiplies by company, that closeness conserves not only temperature, but tenderness. Even the cat, that notoriously self-possessed guardian of grain and grace, earned its place in the nightly cluster. A curled tail, a soft purr, a little pulse of warmth beside the feet, the oldest household technology known to humankind. Outside, houses leaned shoulder to shoulder like friends huddling against the desert's chill. Streets were narrow for a reason. They trapped heat between their walls, making villages warmer by accident and design. What we call urban planning, they called common sense. If one home cooled too fast, it borrowed from its neighbor. The whole settlement was a single organism, exhaling through the cracks of its roofs. The air smelled faintly of oil and papyrus, of baked earth settling into rest. From open courtyards came the sighs of animals bedding down, goats shifting, donkeys lowering their heads, chickens muttering like gossipers before sleep. Every sound carried a pulse of life, proof that the world was not empty, but quietly alive. And there, amid that living silence, began the rituals. Egyptians didn't merely go to sleep, they prepared for it, like worshippers entering a small domestic temple. To sleep was to surrender the body to unseen forces, the cold wind, the wandering soul, the fragile rhythm of breath that linked mortal flesh to the divine. So they approached it with care. A lamp was always the first to be tended. A shallow bowl of clay filled with oil, usually castor or sesame, sometimes scented with myrrh, held a floating wick twisted from flax. The flame was tiny, shy as a star, and it wasn't meant to heat the room, it was meant to bless it. Egyptians believed light itself had protective power. It kept bad spirits or simply bad dreams at bay. To extinguish a lamp carelessly was to invite disorder into the night. Even the act of trimming the wick had ceremony. Women dipped their fingers in perfumed oil before doing it, sealing their skin against dryness and the so-called evil winds that crept through cracks. Those oils, blends of myrrh, lotus, or frankincense, did more than smell divine. They preserved moisture in the skin, acted as mild antiseptics, and, in the chill hours before dawn, held warmth close to the body. Imagine the scene: a mother rubbing oil along her child's arms, whispering that it would keep the desert from stealing his warmth. A husband smoothing the same scent along his wife's shoulders, the gesture halfway between affection and medicine. The whole room glimmered faintly in lamplight, turning each motion into something sacred. Linen, of course, completed the ritual. Egypt's great gift to the ancient world was not just gold or grain, it was cloth. Fine, strong, forgiving cloth, spun from flax grown in the damp fields near the Nile. Linen was purity made visible. Its pale color mirrored the moonlight. Its cool touch calmed the skin after a hot day. But linen could also trap warmth when layered, and the Egyptians learned that trick early. Day garments became night wraps. Tunics shed in the evening were folded into loose shawls, edges tucked beneath knees and shoulders. Old linen never died. It simply changed purpose. Even temple cloths and ritual veils found new life in households once their sacred service ended. Every thread held a memory, and warmth like holiness was meant to circulate. There was humor in this too. One Ostracon from Deir el-Medina records a worker complaining that his wife hoards linen like Pharaoh hoards taxes. Another scribble answers, "Then may you be as warm as his treasury." Even sarcasm was recycled warmth. In wealthier homes, linen came in layers so fine it whispered when touched. Servants folded them like offerings, laying one, then another, until the bed shimmered pale as river light. The goal was never extravagance, it was texture, insulation by softness. Under those folds, a nobleman might lie awake, listening to his house creak with contentment, thinking himself the cleverest man alive for having turned plants into comfort. Yet even he slept not alone. In a noble household, warmth was communal too, only arranged by hierarchy. Servants often lay near doorways or storerooms, close enough that their bodies lent heat to the corridors. The cold was democratic. It respected no rank, but trust determined proximity. The closer you slept to your master's room, the higher your standing. Warmth was status you could feel. Every Egyptian, rich or poor, knew the seasons dictated the choreography of sleep. During Ahet, the flood season, the nights carried river chill, and families huddled indoors. In Pare, when the land blossomed and air softened, mats moved to rooftops. There, under canopies of woven reeds, people slept open to the stars, their breaths joining the slow song of crickets. And in Shemu, the harvest season, the heat returned with vengeance, driving sleepers to shaded courtyards or even temple porticos, where stone floors held the last kindness of night. The rhythm was predictable, almost musical. Each season changed not only how people worked, but how they rested. To live by the Nile was to accept repetition as grace. If the river could rise and fall endlessly without complaint, so could you. During the coldest nights of Ahet, small lamps burned longer, their light trembling against mud brick walls. Parents told stories as the wicks fluttered, tales of gods who traveled through darkness to bring dawn again. Ra steering his sunboat beneath the earth, Bes laughing at demons, Toweret standing guard with the patience of a mother hippopotamus. Every story doubled as a lullaby and a lesson. Warmth, like goodness, returns to those who wait. Faith, too, had its physical symbols. Clay amulets of Bes, the dwarf god of humor and protection, hung near sleeping mats. His grinning face, half guardian, half comedian, promised that no snake or nightmare would dare enter. Bez was ugly on purpose. Ugliness scared evil away. In houses with children, his image was everywhere, scratched into plaster, painted on jars, carved into small headrests. Egyptians understood that laughter was also heat. Tower, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess, kept watch over mothers and infants. Figurines of her rounded belly stood on bedside shelves, her hands resting over the life she shielded. To invoke her was to invoke fertility, safety, and calm breathing. Even the poorest homes found a way to honor her sometimes by placing a simple lump of shaped clay near the door, sometimes by whispering her name into the lamp flame before sleep. Above all these icons hovered the Eye of Horus, painted or carved wherever protection was needed. On walls, jewelry, even the handles of oil jars, it reminded sleepers that they were seen by divine sight. The eye symbolized restoration, the healing of a broken hole. It watched as bodies drifted into dreams, ensuring that what left during sleep would safely return by morning. In this cosmology, night wasn't an interruption of life. It was its equal partner. Day and night mirrored each other the way heat and cold did. To stay warm was to stay balanced. And balance was Ma'at, the order that kept both cosmos and household intact. So the living wrapped themselves in linen for the night, and the dead were wrapped in linen for eternity. The gestures were the same: to be enclosed, to be preserved, to trust that the world would remember your shape until morning. The wind shifts again. It moves through Egypt the way breath moves through a flute, slow, patterned, full of memory. From the delta to the desert edge, life follows that rhythm. The Nile has its moods, and so does the air, but both obey the same hidden measure. The Egyptians didn't need calendars to know the seasons. They could feel them on their skin. When Akhet, the season of flooding, painted the world in damp coolness, homes became cocoons. Mud walls darkened with moisture. The air smelled of river clay, and frogs sang their endless chorus in the marshes. Families slept indoors, pressing closer than usual. A thin layer of mist sometimes gathered over the Nile at night, and the wind that came from it carried a chill that could sneak under doors like a curious spirit. But Egyptians had their ways. Before sleep, they rubbed warm oil along the joints, the wrists, knees, and neck, believing it would keep the body supple and the soul content. Sometimes a lump of heated clay or a brick from the cooking hearth was wrapped in cloth and tucked near the feet. Its glow lasted hours, a quiet pulse beneath the mats. There was no crackling, no smoke, only a slow, earthy warmth that seemed to come from the ground itself. The nights of Akhet were also the most musical. Inside each home, faint sounds layered together. The purr of oil lamps, the rustle of linen, the sigh of someone turning in sleep. It was domestic harmony, a rhythm soft enough to make the gods jealous. Then came Pere, the growing season, when the river retreated and the land returned to breath. The air turned mild, the smell of wet fields replaced by the scent of flowering reeds. During these months, families began migrating upward, first to the courtyards, then to the rooftops. Rooftop sleep was one of Egypt's quiet miracles. Beneath a dome of stars brighter than any lamp, people spread mats of woven reed, light linen sheets, and thin cushions of papyrus fiber. Sometimes they built small windbreaks of mud brick at the roof's edge. Sometimes they simply trusted the breeze to be kind. Children fell asleep, counting constellations that mirrored the carvings in temple ceilings. Farmers woke in the night and thought the Milky Way looked like a trail of spilled grain, a sign that the harvest would be good. Lovers whispered among the stars, and old men told stories to the moon as if to an old friend who had finally come close enough to listen. Even the air felt different up there. It wasn't only cool, it was alive. The heat of day had gone, but the memory of sunlight lingered in the bricks beneath the mats. When you lay down, it was like resting on the body of the world itself, still warm in its heart, even after the sun had gone. By Shemu, the harvest season, Egypt entered its furnace. The day burned, the nights glowed with leftover heat, and sleep became a negotiation with exhaustion. People moved their resting places again, sometimes into storage rooms where grain bins cooled the air, sometimes beneath awnings by the riverbank, where breezes off the water carried the smell of silt and lotus. In these months, the rituals of warmth turned into rituals of endurance. The same oils once rubbed to trap heat were now applied to reflect it. Lotus oil, in particular, became the scent of survival, cool, sweet, a promise that the body could stay civilized while the world blazed. Even the gods were imagined sweating politely. Yet through all these transformations, one idea never changed. Warmth was a matter of relationship. It came from proximity of body to body, of breath to breath, of faith to world. Inside the houses, the small gods kept watch. Bez still grinned from the wall. Taret still stood guard by the door, and the eye of Horus still gleamed faintly in lamplight. Their presence was not decoration. They were contracts, agreements between the seen and the unseen. You would sleep, and they would watch. The ancient word for to sleep also meant to rest under protection. Egyptians did not separate comfort from spirituality. They were the same experience. Even the humble act of smoothing a mat was a prayer. Each gesture, folding linen, adjusting the wick, whispering a blessing, reaffirmed that the household was in harmony with the greater world. And when things went wrong, when a child caught fever, or the night wind howled too sharply, the remedy was never isolation. Neighbors came with jars of oil, with charms, with stories. The cure for cold was always shared. A woman might lend her best shawl to a friend's infant, or a farmer might offer his spare mat to a widow. They understood that warmth, once divided, multiplied. A single flame, if passed carefully, could light 100 lamps. That principle, practical, moral, architectural, was the heart of Egyptian civilization. If you walked through a village after sunset, you'd see the proof of it. Lamps glowed faintly behind slits in the walls, a constellation of human stars across the valley. Their light trembled with the same golden rhythm as the ones above. The people below and the heavens above mirrored each other in silent conversation. Somewhere, an old woman muttered to the night, "Ra rests now. We must keep watch for him." And she meant it. For Egyptians, warmth wasn't only physical, it was cosmic. When the sun god traveled through the underworld each night, he relied on mortal faith to guide him back. Every lamp left burning was a promise that the world awaited his return. There was humor even in devotion. An inscription found on a wall in Thebes reads, "If Ra should oversleep, wake him with laughter." The writer must have smiled while carving it, confident that the gods, like men, appreciated a good joke. Egyptian spirituality thrived on that balance, reverence and familiarity, awe and amusement. It mirrored the climate itself, fierce by day, forgiving by night. You could honor a deity and tease them in the same breath, the way you might scold a friend for being late to dinner. The same spirit infused their nightly prayers. Instead of begging for miracles, They thanked the earth for cooperation. You gave heat to the clay, and the clay gave it back. One hymn says, you lent us wind, and we shaped it into breath. Warmth, they believed, was not created, but borrowed in energy exchanged endlessly between gods, people, and land. That belief shaped every layer of their lives, even their clothing. Linen was more than fabric. It was ethics. To wear it was to participate in purity, to align with the order of things. Its texture cooled under the sun but held body heat at dusk. Thin layers during shamu, thick folds in achet, always linen, always balance. Some garments served both day and night. A worker's tunic, hung near the door after sunset, might become a blanket. The frayed edge of a priest's robe might line a child's mat. The economy of comfort was circular. Nothing left the cycle of warmth unless it disintegrated entirely. And even then, the dust of flax would find its way into new plaster, sealing walls that once again trapped the day's heat for night. The same material that wrapped mummies also wrapped the living. To lie down in linen was to accept kinship with eternity. The act of sleep, after all, mirrored the act of death, and waking mirrored rebirth. In that way, every night rehearsed resurrection. The Egyptians didn't fear this symmetry. They found peace in it. Before sleeping, some families spoke a short invocation. Let me rise with the sun as Ra rises, and rest as Osiris rests. It was both blessing and bedtime story, a reminder that even the gods needed their rest. The wind outside carried its own voice. It hissed softly through palm fronds, rattled reed fences, and sometimes moaned against the doorframe like an animal seeking entry. But no one feared it. The desert's voice was old and familiar. They called it the breath of the West, the exhalation of the underworld. It wasn't an enemy. It was the night reminding them of balance. In homes near the necropolises, where the living and the dead shared the same horizon, people slept easily. They knew the dead were comfortable too. Their tombs were designed with the same logic as houses' thick walls, narrow passages, curved ceilings that caught and released warmth. The architecture of death was simply a perfected version of life. It's difficult sometimes for modern minds to grasp this serenity. We think of warmth as a commodity, something bought, adjusted, switched on. For the Egyptians, it was a rhythm, a conversation. They didn't fight their climate. They listened to it breathe. As winter nights passed, oil lamps burned low and silence thickened. In that stillness, one could feel the philosophy that held the empire together. Ma'at, the perfect balance of forces. Too much flame would ruin it. Too much cold would break it. But here, in this narrow room smelling of clay and myrrh, the equation was exact. A mother reached over and touched her child's hair. A father adjusted the mat so the draft would miss his wife's feet. Outside, the cat sneezed. Nothing divine, nothing dramatic, just small kindnesses looping endlessly through centuries. That was Egypt's secret warmth. Belonging. They didn't invent comfort through wealth or conquest. They found it in rhythm. When you look back from the luxury of modern heat, you might pity them mud brick walls. No chimneys, no wool, no fire. But stay long enough in their quiet, and pity turns to awe. They made peace with the universe by understanding it. The flood, the harvest, the chill wind, the warm skin, all parts of the same design. Even in the tombs, warmth was a promise kept. The linen that wrapped a mummy wasn't just preservation, it was assurance. You will never be cold again. The same oils that soothed the living were poured over the dead. The same prayers whispered beside the lamp were carved into stone. Nothing was wasted. As dawn approached, the air shifted again. Somewhere along the river, a rooster crowed. The lamps flickered their last and died, leaving a pale blue twilight in their wake. The walls still radiated the night's memory, a gentle warmth against the returning cool of morning. A mother stirred, reached for her shawl, and smiled. Another night survived, another balance maintained. For the Egyptians, survival was never desperate. It was graceful. To wake each morning meant the cosmos had agreed to begin again. The family rose slowly. Mats were rolled, oil jars covered, amulets touched for thanks. Outside, neighbors exchanged quiet greetings that sounded almost like prayers. Cool night, warm house? Warm enough. It was not small talk. It was acknowledgement that order had held. The sun lifted above the eastern hills, washing everything in gold. The mud brick walls glowed faintly, as if pleased by their own performance. The cat stretched, the child laughed, the father reached for his tools. Life resumed, and somewhere, in the invisible language between sand and sky, the desert whispered its eternal approval. Warmth, after all, was never a battle in Egypt. It was a dialogue between day and night, flesh and faith, the seen and the unseen. Fire could only consume, but balance could endure forever. That was their true invention, greater than pyramids or hieroglyphs, the art of staying warm without fire and without fear. When the lamps went low and the house began to sigh, Egypt didn't sleep all at once. It slept by rank. The humbler the soul, the closer to the door. The more trusted, the nearer to the inner room where the family lay. Warmth, in the night, was not only comfort, it was status. Servants slept by thresholds, near the clay bolts that sealed the entrance. Their task was both human and spiritual, to keep danger out and domestic order in. If a jar cracked in the chill, if the wind slipped through a shutter, it was the door sleeper who heard first. They were the thin line between the cozy and the cold. It wasn't such a terrible job. The doorway, after all, was the house's warmest artery. Air that left the inner room passed through it, carrying human heat. On winter nights, the servant's mat became a catchment for borrowed warmth. To lie near the door was to inhale other people's breath, second-hand comfort, but comfort nonetheless. And yet, there was a quiet dignity in this arrangement. Egyptian households were small kingdoms, and like all kingdoms, they functioned by layers of proximity. The closer you slept to the head of the house, the more you were trusted. A servant allowed near the bedroom might be the lamp keeper or the child watcher, sometimes even a confidant. Proximity was both physical and moral, a warmth earned over time. Those whose rank or affection allowed them inside tended the night lamps. This was no simple errand. A lamp left too bright would devour oil before dawn, too dim, and the gods might lose their way in the shadows. There was an art to it, trimming the wick with wetted fingers, watching how the flame bowed, feeding it just enough to live. To keep the flame steady was to keep the household spirit steady. Egyptians believed that every home had its own ka, its vital essence, mirrored from the ka of its owner. If the lamp went out before sunrise, that essence might wander. So someone always kept half an eye on the flicker. On the coldest nights, servants took turns with small rituals of borrowed warmth. Clay jars warmed in the kitchen were carried discreetly to their sleeping masters, the Egyptian version of the hot water bottle. Kitchen walls themselves, thick and soot-blackened, radiated gentle heat long after cooking had ceased. Sometimes the older servants slept there near the ashes, claiming the fire's ghost as their companion. Not all homes could afford such hierarchy, of course. In poorer dwellings, servants and masters slept in one space separated only by curtain or conscience. But even there, order remained. Each knew their position in the night's geography. The mat nearest the door, the mat by the jars, the mat under the east wall all carried unspoken meaning. Egypt was a civilization obsessed with boundaries between gods and men, day and night, life and death, but also with the delicate exchanges that crossed those boundaries. The way air slipped through a window, the way warmth flowed from one sleeping body to another, the way dreams leaked from the divine into the mortal mind. These were all acts of transference. Even rest was regulated by relationship. Beyond the house walls, travelers made their own accommodations with the desert's night. Caravans moving between Memphis and Thebes, or along the trade routes toward Nubia and Sinai, learned to read the language of cold sand. They carried little wood. The desert offered no trees. Fires, if built at all, were small, meant for cooking, not comfort. The light alone gave reassurance, a fragile flame trembling against the vast, indifferent dark. Bedrolls were layered from what could be spared woven mats, goat hair blankets, hides that smelled of animals and endurance. Those who could afford it had cloaks of wool imported from the Levant, but most relied on simplicity. Linen under, hide over, faith within. Nomads, herders, and messengers all shared the same code. Fire is luxury, warmth is cooperation. They huddled together, men, animals, and even cargo, forming brief islands of humanity in the frozen sea of sand. Their songs rose softly through the still air, blending with the hiss of dunes. To sing at night wasn't merely entertainment, it was insulation of the soul. Laughter, too, kept the cold away. The desert respected joy more than fear. One traveler's account on Ostrakhan describes a trick. We bury a jar of coals beneath the sand, and by dawn the ground itself is kind. Beneath his matter-of-fact tone, you can hear the intimacy of ancient practicality. The Egyptians may have worshipped the sun, but they knew how to coax its ghosts out of the soil. Nomads carried amulets, of course. A small bez for laughter, a fragment of turquoise against envy, a knot of Isis for safe return. These weren't trinkets of superstition so much as small pieces of order ma'at distilled into stone and string. Under a sky that stretched forever, you needed symbols to remind you that the world still had a center. When they slept, they trusted the desert to keep its silence, and silence was Egypt's second god. The desert at night was not empty. It was simply listening. The wind moved across the dunes like a memory brushing skin. Reeds along the Nile bent in time with unseen hands. Even the animals seemed to obey a rhythm older than breath, jackals crying out, frogs answering from the riverbanks, each sound echoing into stillness. The Egyptians had a word for this kind of quiet. Hesed, not the absence of noise, but the presence of harmony. It was the silence of agreement, of things being in their rightful place. A perfect silence was Ma'at made audible. In that soundscape, architecture itself joined the orchestra. The design of homes and temples was tuned to the environment. Doorways faced the wind, not only for ventilation but for music. Reeds hanging in slits whispered like flutes. Wooden beams creaked in slow counterpoint to the breath of walls cooling after day. The house sang to itself as it fell asleep. Children grew up inside this lullaby. They heard it every night, the murmur of air through papyrus blinds, the scrape of a lizard on plaster, the distant bark of a temple dog. It wasn't frightening, it was familiar, the heartbeat of Egypt. Parents told stories over it, their voices barely above a whisper. They spoke of Ra, who each evening boarded his golden barge and sailed through the underworld, carrying the sun in his arms like a sleeping child. As he traveled, monsters tried to swallow the light serpents, chaos spirits, old grudges given shape. But each dawn, Ra emerged triumphant, reborn in the east. It was the oldest bedtime story in the world, and it worked every time. Children slept because they believed that somewhere, someone was steering through darkness on their behalf. And maybe that's what warmth really is. Trust, translated into temperature. There's humor hidden in that faith. Imagine explaining to a child that the world stays safe because an old man in a boat fights snakes all night. The Egyptians never saw the absurdity. They saw reassurance. The world was dangerous, yes, but never alone. And in that comfort they slept. If you could walk through the alleys of Thebes around midnight, you'd see at every window dark, except for a faint ember glow. Every courtyard quiet, every door closed with care but never locked. Egypt trusted its own rhythm. The living world and the unseen one were on speaking terms. At the edge of the city, by the fields where the Nile's reflection trembled, a single servant might still be awake. She'd be tending a lamp in a noble house or stirring the coals of an oven that would bake tomorrow's bread. The warmth she fed tonight would return as sustenance at dawn. It's a beautiful symmetry, every act of service looping back into comfort. Heat became food, food became life, life became the next night's warmth again. Egypt wasn't a culture of waste. It was a culture of circulation. And so the night hierarchy wasn't cruel. It was efficient. The servant at the door, the wife by the child, the husband near the lamp, each part of the same organism of survival. They didn't need thermostats or walls of glass. They had trust, duty, and the soft mathematics of proximity. When one member of the household turned in sleep, another instinctively adjusted, catching the shifting air. When a jar cracked with the cold, someone murmured in their half-dream, "The god of clay is stretching." They explained discomfort with mythology, and somehow that made it smaller. By the hour before dawn, the house had its own pulse warmth, and breath rising, cooling, exchanging. You could almost chart it. The architecture of intimacy rendered in air currents and quiet. Somewhere beyond, in the desert that hemmed Egypt like a cloak, the nomads lay dreaming under their low hides. The sand beneath them, still holding a trace of yesterday's sun, sighed like an animal asleep. Above, the Milky Way arched, ancient and tender. If you asked one of them how they endured the cold, he might shrug and say, "We sleep in the warmth of our company." And perhaps that was Egypt's truest invention, social heat, the fire made from belonging. It required no fuel, only faith. By midnight, the world was nothing but sound and imagination. The desert didn't sleep, it whispered. To anyone born beyond the valley, the Egyptian night seemed lifeless. But to those who knew it, it was a living instrument tuned perfectly, every silence deliberate, every breath of wind a note. There was the sigh of reeds along the canals, the faint slap of water against mooring posts, the high, distant cry of a jackal that could mean hunger or conversation. The wind sifted through sand like fingers through grain, shaping soft dunes that glimmered even without light. If you stood still long enough, You could feel it playing over your skin, the same air that brushed over pharaohs, farmers, and tomb walls alike. Egyptians were not afraid of the desert's music. They built their lives to match it. Their houses were tuned to it like instruments. Thick walls that dampened chaos. Narrow slits that caught the breeze in a single clean tone. Roofs that creaked softly when the wind turned colder, announcing the hour more faithfully than any clock. That creak, that subtle shift, told mothers when to tuck their children closer, told lamp tenders when to feed the flame, told priests when Ra's barge had entered the deepest stretch of the underworld. The architecture and the cosmos were part of the same rhythm. Egyptians had a saying, "The silence of night is not the absence of sound, but the presence of listening." It was true. The desert at night wasn't mute. It was meditative. The world itself seemed to be thinking. The Nile murmured to itself in the distance, and every now and then a fish splashed against the surface, breaking the mirror of the sky. Even the smallest sound carried for miles: a reed snapping, a footstep on gravel, the low snore of a donkey dreaming of better hay. The night didn't echo. It reflected. Every vibration felt deliberate, placed. And among those sounds, humans added their own. Lullabies. The ancient Egyptians were great singers, not for performance, but for balance. They sang the way we breathe, out of instinct, necessity, and comfort. Mothers hummed to children. Shepherds sang to their flocks. Even workers, resting after long days at the quarry, muttered half-songs to the dust. At night, these voices became soft bridges across the cold. A mother's voice in the dark wasn't simply for the child, it was for the room itself, to remind the air that people still lived here, still cared, still belonged. The songs were simple, but layered with meaning. Ra sails below, we rest above. His fire returns, our hearts will move. Sleep soft, my child. The world is warm, for silence keeps us safe from harm. These words weren't poetry for beauty's sake. They were lullabies as insulation. To speak them was to push back against the night's emptiness, to fill the dark with familiar rhythm. In that rhythm, the cold hesitated. Temples too sang. Deep in Thebes or Abydos, priests recited night hymns to accompany Ra's journey through the underworld. Their voices echoed down corridors carved with stars, each note meant to guide the god's barge safely past serpents and shadows. The sound rose like incense through the roof openings, joining the desert wind. If you had been there, a farmer half asleep in his house, a trader lying by his donkey's flank in the dunes, you might have heard those faint echoes drifting miles through the air, mingling with the jackal's cries. The whole landscape breathed together, as if Egypt itself were one enormous sleeper, murmuring in a dream. And what were dreams, if not Egypt's most private warmth? The Egyptians took them seriously, very seriously. To dream was to receive a message, to step briefly into the divine network where gods, ancestors, and spirits conversed. The mind, they thought, traveled while the body rested, the soul, leaving its earthly cage to wander, returning by dawn like a bird finding its nest again. That's why people left amulets under their pillows or drew protective symbols on headrests. A carved bess might grin up from the wooden curve that supported the neck, guarding against nightmares and neck cramps with equal competence. A small figure of Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess with pendulous breasts and motherly ferocity, stood nearby, watching over those who dreamed. In some houses, they placed a bowl of water beside the bed to catch evil spirits, or to reflect the face of the dreamer, reminding the wandering soul where to return. Even the poorest family might whisper a few lines before sleeping. Let my ba fly, but find me again. They feared a soul that lost its way as much as a body that froze. There were, of course, specialists for everything, including dreams, temples of Serapis and Imhotep, and even older shrines of Bes and Thoth practiced what we'd now call dream incubation. People seeking healing or guidance slept in sacred chambers, breathing in incense until their minds drifted beyond wakefulness. Priests interpreted the visions that followed, prescribing cures or omens as if decoding letters from another world. The Egyptians kept dream books, long lists of symbols and meanings. A cat in a dream might mean good fortune, a crocodile, danger, a flood, renewal. Some interpretations were practical, others delightfully absurd. One surviving text says, "If a man dreams of eating crocodile flesh, he shall become a great official." Another adds, "If he dreams of drinking warm beer, he shall speak foolishly." Humor ran through their superstition like gold through quartz. Even their dream logic had logic. Dreams were warmth of the mind, fire without smoke. They illuminated without burning, and they were democratic. Pharaohs dreamed of gods whispering destiny into their ears. Farmers dreamed of their oxen speaking politely about the next harvest. Both woke believing they'd been visited by truth. Sometimes dreams turned communal. Whole villages might wake speaking of the same strange vision, a flood of serpents or a shining disk. These shared dreams became omens, woven into local prophecy or temple records. Egypt was a land of listeners, and dreams were just another voice in the choir. To dream was not escape, it was participation. The sleeping mind helped the universe stay in tune. Of course, not all dreams were kind. Some were cold, the kind that left sweat freezing on the skin. The kind that made one whisper Bess's name twice instead of once. But even nightmares had purpose. They were warnings. Balance adjusting itself through terror. Egyptians didn't banish bad dreams. They interpreted them, folded them back into Ma'at's grand accounting. Imagine waking before dawn, heart pounding, still tasting the dust of some phantom desert. You'd rise quietly, light a lamp, whisper thanks to Bez for returning your ba safely. You'd dip your fingers in oil, draw a small circle on the wall, and say, "What came in fear leaves in laughter." Then you'd go back to bed. The world, having been acknowledged, would calm itself again. By morning, the night's chill would have passed, and the dreams, good or bad, would belong to the gods now. Egypt had made peace with its own subconscious. Even the way they described death was dreamlike. The dead were not gone. They were asleep in the west, resting in the cool desert where the sun itself slept each evening. The tombs, carved into cliffs glowing gold by day, turned blue and silent by night, as if the entire necropolis were breathing slowly in its sleep. To the Egyptians, the afterlife was simply a perfected version of the same nightly journey everyone took. The ba leaving the body, traveling through darkness, returning at dawn. Every sunrise was a resurrection rehearsal. Every dream was a small eternity survived. And so, warmth itself took on a symbolic meaning, no longer just heat, but continuity. The warmth of a shared mat became the warmth of a shared cosmos. The glow of a lamp mirrored the glow of Ra's eternal voyage. The great comfort of Egypt was not that it was safe, but that it was rhythmic. Nothing truly ended. Everything turned. Day into night, life into death, cold into warmth, silence into song. The Egyptians did not conquer their nights. They befriended them. Sometimes, late in the dark, a breeze would stir the papyrus blinds, brushing the face of a sleeper like the touch of a parent. People said that was the breath of Isis herself, checking in on her children. Others swore it was simply the Nile exhaling. Either way, they smiled and went back to sleep. Their trust was astonishing, not naive, but mature. It came from generations of evidence. The sun had always risen again. The world had always balanced itself. The night had always ended in warmth. Faith for them was empirical. The last hours before dawn were Egypt's most tender. The air smelled of dew and faint smoke from spent lamps. The walls, still warm from the previous day, radiated a slow farewell to darkness. Within each home, breath by breath, warmth shifted from people back into architecture. A servant stirred first, yawning, rising to open the shutters before the master woke. The act was almost ritual, the house exhaling. Cool light slid in, gilding the sleeping forms, and for a moment, the line between dream and day blurred. In temples, priests began their morning hymns. Awake, O sun, we have guarded your passage. In fields, farmers rolled up mats and shook the sand from their clothes. Children rubbed their eyes, still heavy with night's kindness. And everywhere, people moved through the same unspoken gratitude. That warmth had endured without fire. That balance had held. The desert, that vast, patient neighbor, said nothing. It didn't need to. It had played its part, letting the chill come and go, teaching yet again the art of moderation. If you were to watch Egypt wake from above the slow flare of lamps extinguished, the return of color to the landscape, you'd see that the whole country moved like a single creature turning over in its sleep. Perhaps that's what they meant all along by ma'at. Not perfection, but participation, a willingness to live in tune with everything else. And in that harmony, warmth became more than survival. It became grace. The same grace that let a servant find comfort by a doorway, a nomad sing himself to sleep in the dunes, a mother hum beneath a reed roof, a priest whisper to a god in the dark, all of them practicing the oldest Egyptian secret. That warmth is never made. It is remembered. When you think of a bed, you probably imagine softness, a place to sink, to vanish, to let your bones forget they exist. But to the ancient Egyptians, the bed was not something you vanished into. It was something that remembered you. They did not see a bed as furniture. It was cosmology, a miniature universe, designed to guide you safely from day to night, from waking to sleeping, from life to whatever came after. Every bed was a little cosmos built in wood, shape, and symbol, a domestic version of the sun's journey through the heavens. And, like all of Egypt's best inventions, it started with function and ended in faith. Beds in ancient Egypt were not flat. They were curved, bending gently under the back like a hammock carved from logic. Egyptians slept slightly elevated at the head, the body following the natural arc of comfort that farmers, not physicians, had discovered long before anatomy textbooks. The bed's curve mimicked the posture of the earth itself, arched under the sun, generous, forgiving. Most were made from sycamore or acacia, though palm wood and imported cedar whispered of wealth. The slats were bound with leather thongs or woven cord, sometimes covered with linen mats. They were functional yet dignified, like everything the Egyptians made, halfway between tool and theology. And then there were the legs. Oh, the legs. No ordinary furniture feet would do. The Egyptians carved them into lions, crouching, muscled, poised mid-prowl, as if every sleeper were a monarch guarded by sacred predators. It was symbolism, of course, but also psychology. Lions represented protection, vigilance, the strength of the sun at dawn. When you slept on lion legs, you weren't just lying down. You were resting on the shoulders of cosmic guardians who never blink. The irony, perhaps, is that actual lions would have been terrible bedfellows, but art allowed for gentler metaphors. Between the curves and the lions, the bed became a stage. And like any stage, it needed props enter the headrest. If there's one piece of ancient Egyptian design that bewilders modern comfort seekers, it's that stone or wooden crescent perched under the neck. You've probably seen one in a museum and thought, how could anyone sleep on that? The answer is, beautifully, if you were Egyptian. Headrests, called wares, lifted the head just high enough to align breath and posture. They kept hairstyles neat, yes, but also had ritual purpose. The Egyptians believed the head was sacred, the seat of the soul's identity, and to elevate it during sleep mirrored the lifting of the sun above the horizon. To sleep with the head raised was to honor rebirth, to greet the next day like a miniature resurrection. The headrest wasn't simply practical, it was magical. Many were carved or inscribed with protective symbols. The eye of Horus, the scarab, the sun rising between two mountains. In this small wooden ark rested the philosophy of an empire, that every night was a rehearsal for eternity. If you died in your sleep, well, you'd already been practicing for years. Every piece of the bed had meaning. The lotus symbol of rebirth often blossomed along the rails or footboards. The papyrus stalk, sign of life and freshness, curved up the sides. Gold paint or inlays weren't ostentation. They were metaphors for the sun's eternal glow. The bed itself became a temple to the idea of waking again in the morning, in the afterlife, or in some gentler form of tomorrow. And it wasn't just the pharaohs who slept in symbolism. Even common folk imitated this cosmic geometry in simpler ways. A humble craftsman in Deir el-Medina might shape his bed legs into short blocks, paint them with red ochre for luck, and place a rough stone headrest beneath his neck. He might tuck a charm under his mat, perhaps a small clay bez, with his tongue out and his smile broad, ready to laugh off evil dreams. To lie down in Egypt was never just to rest. It was to align yourself with the rhythm of the universe. Some nights, that rhythm must have been noisy. Cats prowled the roofs, dogs grumbled in the courtyards, and neighbors snored like rival priests chanting in their sleep. But beneath it all, the architecture hummed with harmony. A curved bed beneath a curved roof beneath a curved sky. Egypt was nothing if not consistent. The Egyptians, pragmatic as ever, also made use of bedside remedies before surrendering to sleep. Archaeological texts and wall depictions reveal an array of household rituals that sound oddly familiar. They believed in the medicinal power of scent and touch, rubbing the temples with oil of lotus, anointing the wrists with honey mixed with myrrh, sipping beer sweetened with dates, or a warm draught of milk and herbs. Honey in particular was the cure for almost everything: wounds, stomach aches, loneliness, and apparently insomnia. It sweetens the spirit, one physician wrote, and tells the body to loosen its hold on the day. Even their medicine was poetic. And yes, there was humor. One fragmentary note from Deir el-Medina reads, "I cannot sleep because my wife has stolen my headrest." To which another scribe added, "Then sleep upon her tongue, it rests always on your name." Egyptian domestic banter was as eternal as its monuments. But beyond wit, there was real intimacy. The way they spoke of rest, of touch, of warmth, all of it conveyed an understanding that comfort was communal. The bed was not isolation, but union, with a spouse, with family, with the gods. Even their craftsmanship reflected this philosophy of tenderness, disguised as practicality. In Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb artisans, we find the purest evidence of Egyptian domestic grace. These were the people who painted pharaohs' afterlives by day and built their own beds by night. Their work was exquisite but humble joints, fitted so precisely that a bed could last decades, smooth to the touch but strong enough to bear the weight of both body and meaning. Wood was precious. Linen was labor. Every piece carried respect for the tree, for the spinner, for the sleeper. They didn't build to impress, they built to endure. Their furniture whispered a functionality elevated into art, what modern design would later call form-following function, though Egypt had mastered it 3 millennia early. Each curve, each carving was both purpose and poetry. At night, after painting eternity on the walls of royal tombs, those artisans returned to their small homes, their own beds simpler but no less sacred. They lay down knowing that the same principles that guarded kings guarded them too: symmetry, balance, warmth, and story. And what stories they told! Egyptian nights were rich with them tales of gods disguised as cats, of love that outlasted death, of pharaohs who dreamed the stars into order. Storytelling itself was medicine. Words filled the air like incense, keeping the night watchful and kind. A father might murmur to his child about how the goddess Nut swallowed the sun each evening and gave birth to it every dawn, a divine version of bedtime digestion. The absurdity was the point. Laughter was warmth, too. All of this, the beds, the rituals, the oils, the jokes, formed a system of care that didn't require fire. Egypt's genius lay in its restraint. Where other civilizations fought the night, Egypt collaborated with it. Fire, after all, was a fickle god. Mesopotamia used braziers, glowing metal bowls of embers that warmed but smoked the lungs black. The Greeks gathered round hearths, spreading flame and philosophy in equal measure, but their nights were filled with sparks and ash. The Romans, ever ambitious, invented the hypocaust, heating floors through systems of smoke and cruelty slaves, tending furnaces so senators could sleep in warmth they never earned. Egypt simply breathed. Their homes stayed temperate without roaring fires. Their nights glowed without smoke. Their beds radiated memory, not combustion. It wasn't indifference to comfort. It was obedience to balance. They knew that every flame, no matter how small, invited disorder. Fire consumed Ma'at. Warmth preserved it. Even in the desert's heart, where night could freeze skin into sandpaper, Egypt refused to light what it couldn't control. The lamp was for vision, not temperature. The body, the air, the architecture, those were the true keepers of heat. You could say Egypt invented passive design before the term existed. They'd have called it something simpler: wisdom. And wisdom doesn't roar. It glows. That glow lived in every object they touched: the sheen of polished wood, the gleam of linen under starlight, the faint shimmer of oil brushed over the skin. It wasn't spectacle. It was continuity. Egypt knew that warmth and beauty were the same thing at different speeds. When they built to outlast. When they slept to remember. When they dreamed of waking. And so the bed, humble or golden, curved or simple, became the hinge between two eternities, the night and the forever after. And that's where the story of sleep turned spiritual. Because in Egypt, You didn't stop sleeping when you died. You simply slept longer. Beautiful, let's close the circle of Egypt's night with the final act. When dawn came for the living, it came differently for the dead. For the Egyptians, death was simply the longest night, one that required preparation not in despair, but in design. If a bed carried you through one lifetime of evenings, a tomb bed carried you through forever. Step inside any royal burial chamber, and you'll see it. The same language of comfort, translated into stone. The afterlife was not imagined as some abstract heaven. It was continuity, an improved version of the bedroom you already knew. Walls painted in ochre, and gold replaced mud brick. Ceilings became constellations. Lamps turned into stars, fixed and flawless. Everything familiar, simply perfected. The orientation mattered. Beds in tombs almost always faced west to east, mirroring the sun's nightly voyage below the horizon and its rebirth at dawn. To lie in the west was to rest. To rise in the east was to live again. The very position of the body echoed the daily resurrection of Ra. Even death obeyed the circadian rhythm. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered by candlelight after millennia of silence, 3 beds waited, each shaped differently for a different realm of eternity. One curved like a lion, one sleek as a cow, one winged like the sky itself. They weren't for variety. They were cosmology carved in wood. The lion for dawn's strength, the cow for nurturing dusk, the sky bed for the infinite in between. The boy king would never feel cold again, not because the tomb was warm, but because it had been engineered to keep him within balance forever. Every detail of a funerary bed copied its living counterpart, only more deliberate. The linen that wrapped the body wasn't random cloth. It was domestic fabric transformed into theology. The same material that had touched the living skin now swaddled immortality. Each layer, hundreds upon hundreds, acted as both insulation and incantation. The wrapping was warmth given a second purpose: preservation. A funerary chamber was, in essence, a bedroom extended beyond breath. Jars of perfumed oil stood like bedside cosmetics. Sandals waited neatly by the wall. The headrest rested in place, ready for dreams without interruption. Egypt didn't bury its dead. It tucked them in. They called tombs houses of eternity, not metaphorically, but architecturally. Doorways, columns, niches, all replicated domestic spaces. To enter such a tomb is to walk into a perfect stillness, where architecture pretends the inhabitant might wake at any moment and ask for another blanket of linen. The air inside those chambers is cool, eternally cool. Not freezing, not hostile, but serene, the way the inside of an eggshell feels. For Egyptians, that coolness was peace. They equated the absence of decay with the presence of calm. The ideal temperature of the afterlife was neither hot nor cold. It was balanced, unchanging. The same Ma'at that governed the Nile's flood also governed the climate of forever. Stone replaced warmth. Symbolism replaced fire. A wall painting of the sun was as good as sunlight itself. A carved jar of ointment was the eternal form of fragrance. What mattered wasn't heat, but memory of heat. The Egyptians had learned that symbols outlast sensation. Even the artisans who built these tombs, the men of Deir el-Medina, carried that lesson home. They knew how to create comfort out of permanence. In daylight, they painted Ra's voyage across golden ceilings for their pharaohs. At dusk, they brewed beer and told stories under modest reed roofs. Their own tombs were small but tender, lined with the same care they gave their kings. A few carved a bed from local limestone, crude perhaps, but strong enough to cradle a soul. Archaeologists have found tools still lying near their hands, as if they stopped working one evening, lay down for a nap, and never got up. Their graves smell faintly of gypsum, and resin the perfume of devotion to craft. If you could ask them what they built, they might answer, comfort. That doesn't burn. They were, in a way, Egypt's philosophers with chisels. They turned function into faith, and labor into love. Every curve of a chair, every coil of rope, every linen fold spoke of a worldview that prized endurance over indulgence. They understood that the secret of civilization was not abundance, but proportion. Their night remedies survived in fragments, crushed herbs steeped in honey for aching throats, warmed bricks for weary feet, milk mixed with beer for calming nerves. None of these concoctions promised miracles. They promised participation in the rhythm of life. To soothe pain was to affirm balance. To share warmth was to practice divinity. One text from the workers' village prescribes rubbing the body with oil of sycamore and words of kindness. The dosage, as much as the heart desires. Egyptians treated tenderness as legitimate medicine touch, scent, voice, all measurable components of healing. Even laughter was prescribed. Bez, god of joy and protector of sleep, wasn't confined to icons. He lived in the banter of friends, the teasing of lovers, the jokes painted discreetly on the back walls of tombs. A good dream follows a belly full of beer, reads one. They knew that the mind must be warmed before the body can rest. All of this, the craftsmanship, the care, the quiet humor, reflected a civilization that understood restraint as a creative act. The Egyptians were surrounded by heat. They did not need to worship it. They were surrounded by death. They did not need to fear it. Their genius lay in refusal. They refused panic, refused excess, refused the idea that more flame meant more life. Where their neighbors built hearths and furnaces, Egypt built memory. Compare them. In Mesopotamia, night centered around the brazier, a small cauldron of burning coals that hissed and spat, filling houses with both warmth and coughs. Smoke coiled up like serpents through reed roofs. The air was never still. The gods there demanded fire, and fire answered with chaos. In Greece, the hearth was holy. The goddess Hestia lived inside every flame, and families fed her constantly food, oil, sacrifices. Theirs was a warmth of dialogue, human and divine negotiating over smoke. Beautiful, yes, but restless. A Greek night always flickered. In Rome, the hypocaust turned warmth into engineering. Hot air pumped through floors and walls, heating villas at the cost of an army of slaves stoking furnaces below. Comfort came through conquest, human fuel for marble luxury. Warmth became hierarchy. And then Egypt, calm, pale, balanced. No roaring hearths, no smoking braziers, no underfloor furnaces. Theirs was the warmth of patience. Their lamps were for light, not for heat. Their walls were thick, their beds intelligent, their rituals rhythmic. Egypt chose design over drama. One might call it minimalism. They would have called it ma'at. When fire appeared in Egyptian art, it was almost never in homes that belonged to gods and the afterlife. The sun's fire, the fire of creation, the purifying flame of judgment. For mortals, the proper relationship with flame was distance. The lamp was enough, a small, controlled sun resting on clay, enough to see, not enough to destroy. There's a quiet humor in that restraint. Imagine a Greek or Roman visitor seeing an Egyptian family eat dinner by a single flickering lamp and ask, "Why not make a bigger fire?" The Egyptian would shrug and reply, "Why make a bigger shadow?" Because they knew the secret. Heat and light are both born from fire, but so are smoke and fear. Egypt wanted only the first two. It preferred harmony to spectacle, balance to blaze. Even their gods of warmth were mild. Ra's heat was disciplined. Sekhmet's flame, though fierce, was tamed through prayer and beer. Every energy that could destroy was given a festival to soften it. They believed that what you honor gently will not devour you. By that logic, the entire civilization was a bed, curved, balanced, supported by patient craftsmanship, strong enough to carry eternity's weight. And the tombs were its pillows. Inside those stone rooms, the last echo of hammer and chisel faded into the hush of afterlife. The artisans stepped back, wiped dust from their brows, and looked at their work not as a construction site but as a cradle. They had built silence capable of holding a king. Centuries later, when explorers cracked open those seals, they found that silence still intact, cool and steady, the linen still intact, the oils still fragrant. Time itself had behaved. Egypt had managed to civilize even decay. In that still air the old philosophy lingered. Warmth remembered is better than warmth spent. It is the same wisdom that let their mud brick houses hold the sun overnight. The same wisdom that told them to trust silence over fire. The same wisdom that made them wrap their dead in layers of linen rather than flames. Continuity, not combustion. To live warm was good. To stay balanced was divine. And that balance still hums through their ruins. Walk through any temple at dusk, the air cooling, the sandstone exhaling, and you'll feel it. The invisible residue of a climate perfectly managed without machines, of a people who thought architecture could behave morally. The columns glow amber where the sun's last light touches them. The shadows remain kind. The walls, thick with history, radiate stored warmth from the day, not enough to comfort your hands, but enough to remind you that the world still keeps score. That's Egypt's final lullaby. Warmth not as fire, but as memory. Comfort not as luxury, but as alignment. When night descends, the tourists leave. The last guide's voice fades. The temple breathes again. Sand settles in the courtyards. A heron cries from the river. Somewhere deep inside, a forgotten air pocket sighs the past, adjusting its blankets. If you stay a moment longer, you'll see what the Egyptians saw. That the sun never truly sets. It only changes rooms. In that truth lies their entire philosophy of warmth, sleep, and soul. Everything continues. Nothing is wasted. The fire that isn't lit still glows inside stone, inside memory, inside you. And as the desert folds itself into night, the air cools to its perfect calm, the same calm the ancient sleepers trusted every evening. The Nile gleams like a ribbon of bronze, then fades into indigo. The stars return, each one a tiny headrest for the sky. You close your eyes, and Egypt exhales. The mud brick remembers. The linen breathes. The balance holds. And somewhere in the quiet between two eternities, you realize what they knew all along. Warmth doesn't need fire. The night has deepened again. The stars above Thebes hang low, soft as dusted gold. The world has gone quiet, except for the faint lap of the Nile against its muddy banks. a sound so gentle it feels like the river itself is breathing in its sleep. You imagine stepping once more into a worker's home at Deir el Medina, the artisan's village tucked behind the cliffs. The air still smells of plaster and sweat, of crushed pigment and freshly hewn cedar. Inside, a lamp flickers, its wick trimmed to a precise point. A man sits cross-legged beside his bed, running a hand along the polished curve of a headrest he has just finished carving. He smiles faintly. Tomorrow, it will belong to a neighbor. Tonight, it warms his mind to know his craft will cradle another dream. These artisans understood the holiness of comfort. Their entire world revolved around it, not indulgent comfort, but balanced comfort, the kind that lets the body surrender without fear. They built beds for kings, and they built their own. The difference was only in ornament, never in love. Sometimes they worked by moonlight, when the desert air was cooler and the hammer's tap echoed far and sweet. The rhythm of their work scrape, hush, breathe, became a kind of music, a heartbeat of civilization. They were not poets, yet every stroke of the chisel sang. Archaeologists once found an ostracon, a shard of limestone scratched with the words, "The bed is good when the dreams are kind." No name, no date, just that quiet truth, scrawled by a man who probably never imagined the world would read it thousands of years later. It is the kind of sentence that belongs in every home, ancient or modern. Nearby, his wife may have been spinning flax into fine thread, her fingers moving faster than speech. The thread gleamed pale in lamplight, as if it remembered daylight. Linen was their miracle fabric, breathable, pure, endlessly renewable. It bound wounds, clothed bodies, wrapped the dead, and softened sleep. To weave linen was to weave safety. They did not chase luxury. They cultivated peace. Every evening, these workers shared what little warmth they had. In the narrow courtyards, neighbors sat together on low stools, exchanging gossip and bowls of lentil stew. Children played with reed toys in the dust. The laughter carried lightly between walls made from the same earth they walked upon. When the air cooled, they pressed closer, people, cats, dogs, and even the occasional goose seeking refuge under the same roof. The Egyptians never truly slept alone. They slept in company with the living world. If you listened carefully, you might hear the whisper of prayers spoken under breath. May Bes guard this bed. May Toret guard this child. May the wind remember mercy. No fire flared, no hearth glowed, just breath, body, and faith, keeping the cold at bay. The idea of heat was not conquest, but conversation. The Egyptians didn't think of warmth as something you created, it was something you persuaded, coaxed from clay and air like a story from an elder. One woman, whose burial letters were found near the Valley of the Queens, wrote to her husband long after his death, "I still warm your side of the mat with my hand." It was a message meant for eternity, yet achingly human, a small testimony to the intimacy that shaped their nights. Inside the great temples, the same domestic tenderness existed on a cosmic scale. The priests of Karnak, or Luxor, prepared the god's bed every evening, laying fresh linen and placing incense nearby. They believed even gods required rest. The temple itself became a giant bedroom. Lamps dimmed, doors closed, hymns whispered. The divine statue slept, and so the world remained in order. Outside those walls, the same ritual repeated in 1,000 homes. Children were tucked under woven cloth. Elders sighed into sleep. The night spread its cool, transparent veil over the valley. In every bed, mortal or divine, The same rhythm pulsed. Breathe in, release, trust. The refusal of fire was not denial, but genius. Fire destroyed balance. Smoke offended the god's nostrils and blackened Ma'at's harmony. Instead, Egyptians learned to store the day's sunlight inside their architecture in thick mud brick walls, in earthen floors that remembered warmth, in the shared pulse of bodies lying side by side. The science of this serenity is still measurable today. The walls of their houses, nearly half a meter thick, absorbed the afternoon heat and released it through the night in a slow exhalation. The ceilings were low to trap comfort, the doorways narrow to tame the wind. It was climate wisdom wrapped in beauty. Modern architects call it thermal mass. The Egyptians simply called it home. At Deir el Medina, the artisans' houses lined the slope like stacked honeycombs. Their walls touched, their warmth overlapped. One house's retained heat became another's insulation. Every breath of a sleeping family added to the invisible climate of the street. The whole village glowed with a temperature made of coexistence. Imagine walking through that alley at midnight, the air heavy with the scent of oil and plaster, the faint sound of snoring through clay. You could almost hear the civilization breathing as one organism, and beneath it all, the Nile murmured, a long pulse of liquid memory. Egyptians believed the river never truly slept. It only dreamed in water. Its cool breath passed through open shutters, mixing with the stored warmth of the walls, creating an equilibrium that could soothe both skin and soul. Even the animals participated in this nocturnal truce. Cats curled near lamps, not for light but for companionship. Dogs guarded doorways with one ear twitching. Donkeys huddled in courtyards, their slow exhalations adding warmth to the night air. Every creature contributed. It's almost comical. Really the world's most monumental civilization, surviving its nights not with grand inventions, but with shared body heat and patience. Yet perhaps that's why they lasted so long. They wasted nothing, not even warmth. When morning came, the rituals reversed. The bed was straightened, linen folded, oils returned to their jars. Egyptians treated waking as seriously as sleeping. To rise from the mat was to repeat creation, to be reborn into order. The first breath of morning was sacred. It linked the sleeper's small awakening to the sun's great one. They even had a prayer for it. You wake with Ra, your limbs are his rays. You can picture it. A man standing in the doorway, eyes half closed, feeling sunlight spill across his chest like blessing. His wife sweeps dust from the floor. The child chases a cat through the courtyard. The lamp from the night before still smokes faintly, curling a thin ribbon into the blue air. Everything ordinary, everything divine. And yet, beyond this peace, a strange kind of humor always hummed beneath Egyptian calm, a self-awareness that kept serenity from turning solemn. One ostracon found near the workmen's huts reads, "Too much beer, not enough sleep, may Ra forgive the imbalance." Another says, "If the gods wished us to rise early, they would not have made linen soft." Ah, they laughed at themselves, at their rituals, at the tiny rebellions of being human in a world so full of order. Their laughter was warmth, their jokes a flicker of internal fire that never burned but glowed eternally. Far to the south, along caravan trails, travelers also learned Egypt's lesson of moderation. The desert, wide as an ocean of silence, forced humility. Nomads built no hearths, only shallow pits shielded from wind. They wrapped themselves in wool and leather, huddled close, shared songs, the warmth of voice replacing the heat of flame. In their small circles of flickering lamplight, The desert became a communal bedroom, stretching to infinity. Some carried amulets of the sun disk, carved from copper or clay, believing that the memory of daylight could fend off the cold. Others hung small shells or beads around their necks, reminders that even the sea, now hundreds of miles away, once held warmth. It was superstition, perhaps, but also poetry. The idea that warmth could travel across time and space if you loved it enough. The same philosophy built the pyramids, those vast geometric dreams designed to hold not fire, but eternity. They were the universe rendered in stone, enormous headrests for pharaohs who refused to wake too soon. Inside them, the temperature never changed. It stayed cool, steady, immune to both flame and frost. The pyramids were the ultimate climate-controlled chambers, monuments to balance. Even now, step inside and your breath slows. The air feels neither dead nor alive, just waiting. That stillness was the Egyptians' ultimate achievement, a mastery of time itself. They didn't conquer death, they made peace with it. The afterlife wasn't imagined as paradise, but as perfect equilibrium, the same comfort they'd known each night, extended forever. And what greater luxury is there than continuity? Every tomb, from the humblest shaft to the grandest temple, carried traces of domestic intimacy. A comb, a folded tunic, a jug of beer, a loaf of bread, a small wooden stool. These weren't tokens of wealth. They were the vocabulary of peace, a person's comfort kit for the infinite night. Even the great Book of the Dead, with its spells and declarations, was less about magic and more about reassurance. Instructions on how to wake gently into eternity. To the Egyptians, dying without comfort was unthinkable. Warmth wasn't luxury. It was morality. Every soul deserved a peaceful bed, even if that bed was made of earth. And so their civilization outlived its conquerors, not by sword or flame, but by stillness. Empires that worshipped fire burned out. Egypt simply cooled and waited. The sand covered its cities, but never its wisdom. Tonight, as you drift further into this ancient hush, you can almost feel their presence, not ghosts, but craftsmen of peace, their calloused hands guiding you into balance. The wind outside your own walls carries a faint echo of the desert, the same wind that once swept over Thebes, Memphis, and Amarna. It whispers the same truth it whispered then. Rest. The warmth you seek is already here. The lamp beside you could be theirs. The linen covering you could have been woven by a woman from Deir el-Medina, her laughter still trapped in the threads. Every breath you take repeats a pattern older than pyramids. Inhale light, exhale fear. And somewhere, deep beneath the sand, the tombs still wait in their gentle coolness. Inside them, wood that once lived still dreams. Linen still guards what remains of breath. Time sleeps without decay. And the gods, amused perhaps, watch over a civilization that found its immortality not in gold or conquest, but in the temperature of trust. If you listen hard enough, you can hear the slow creak of an ancient bed settling, as though eternity itself is getting comfortable. The noise is small, but it carries. Egypt does not roar, it murmurs. And so the story closes, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it only exhales, the way a sleeper does just before drifting deeper. The desert outside is cold, yes. The stars sharp, the wind dry. But inside this memory of mud brick and linen, everything remains perfectly warm. The warmth of balance, the warmth of memory, the warmth of being part of something that never needed flame to glow. Rest now. The Nile still flows, the sun will rise again, and the Egyptians, eternal in their patience, will keep the night for you until it does. Beautiful, I understand exactly what you want. A final 3,000-word epilogue, expanding from that quiet moment at the end of section 4, where the story half ends, half drifts into eternity. This will deepen the after-feeling of the narrative, reflective, atmospheric, hypnotic, and infused with that dark gold humor and tenderness your boring history for sleep stories are known for. The pacing will stay slow and melodic, like the night breathing its last sigh before dawn. And so the story closes, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it only exhales, the way a sleeper does just before drifting deeper. The desert outside is cold, yes, the stars sharp, the wind dry. But inside this memory of mud brick and linen, everything remains perfectly warm, the warmth of balance, the warmth of memory, the warmth of being part of something that never needed flame to glow. Rest now. The Nile still flows, the sun will rise again, and the Egyptians, eternal in their patience, will keep the night for you until it does. Yet even as the listener drifts toward sleep, Egypt is not done speaking. It murmurs through the silence, a long whisper in languages half forgotten, but still understood by the bones. Stone has a way of remembering syllables. Every carved wall, every temple lintel, every grain of desert dust still hums with the same phrase, "Be still and endure." The wind that crosses the dunes tonight is the same wind that brushed the braids of the builders at Deir el-Medina. It sighs across the cliffs of Thebes, sneaks through broken doorways, rattles reeds where frogs once sang. The air is older than memory but fresher than breath. It doesn't mourn, it merely continues. That is Egypt's truest art continuation. Other civilizations built for glory. Egypt built for rhythm. Empires rose and vanished while she kept time with the Sunday. Her temples fell. Her gods changed names, yet her mornings still began with the same sound. The splash of water on hands, the hush of prayer before labor. To live in such harmony is its own immortality. Imagine now the Valley of the Kings under moonlight. The entrances to the tombs yawn like sleeping mouths. Each passage stretches deep into stone, a hallway of still air and painted eternity. Here the artisan's work still glows colors that should have faded centuries ago but somehow refuse. They shine like stubborn dreams, refusing death, refusing dust. Look closer, and you see details left by human hands. A fingerprint in plaster, a brushstroke wobbling where someone's arm must have trembled. These flaws are proof of life small, tender reminders that perfection was never the point. The Egyptians didn't need flawless art. They needed lasting meaning. Even mistakes became sacred if they endured. A bat stirs in the rafters, and dust drifts like incense through the beam of your lantern. The silence feels liquid, not absence, but presence, slowed to the speed of stone. If you speak here, your voice comes back changed, softened, as if the tomb itself edits you for balance. Egypt always did have good taste in acoustics. And outside, the sand shifts again, erasing footprints the way time erases everything except pattern. Tomorrow, there will be new prints, new footsteps, new listeners. The cycle never ends, it only pauses to breathe. Somewhere far away, perhaps in a modern museum, a fragment of that world sits behind glass. A headrest carved 3,000 years ago, its curve still polished by someone's neck. Visitors pass it without much thought. A relic, an artifact, but to touch it would be to feel the echo of warmth, the invisible residue of countless nights. Objects like that are time's souvenirs, still carrying the temperature of belief. Every civilization leaves such traces. Rome left ruins, Greece left words, Mesopotamia left clay. But Egypt left temperature, the sensation of a world that refused extremes. That's why its ruins don't feel dead, they feel asleep. If you've ever stood among them at dusk, you know the effect. The light turns copper, then mauve, then finally the color of forgotten lullabies. The stones radiate the day's stored heat long after the sun is gone. It's as if they're still caring for someone, still remembering their purpose. Maybe that's what keeps travelers so quiet there. Even the loudest fall silent, as though entering a room where someone beloved has just fallen asleep. You lower your voice without knowing why. You walk slower. You start to match your breath to the rhythm of something ancient and kind. Egypt doesn't demand awe. It teaches pacing. Stand too long in her sun and you'll burn. Rush through her streets and you'll miss the coolness waiting behind every wall. She rewards the listener, not the conqueror. And she's still teaching that lesson, even now, to every restless tourist and sleepless soul. If you listen closer, beneath the whisper of sand, you can almost hear laughter. Not mocking, just amused. Egypt has seen everything: the rise of empires, the arguments of archaeologists, the drone of air conditioners claiming to improve on her designs. She chuckles quietly because she knows the truth. They'll break, she won't. Her houses, though collapsed, still breathe better than most modern buildings. Her principles of passive cooling are copied in glass towers that pretend to be new. Her sense of moderation survives under different names: sustainable architecture, thermal regulation, eco-design. She would have smiled at the irony: humanity reinventing what she perfected with mud and patience. But she wouldn't scold. She never did. Egypt's wisdom was maternal, firm, amused, forgiving, like a mother who watches her children rediscover lessons she whispered long ago. Don't fight the world, she seems to say. Shape yourself to it. Let the wind be your architect. The wind agrees. It dances along the ridges, carries cool air through the open courtyards of Luxor, swirls through date palms that glitter faintly in the starlight. Each leaf trembles like a tuning fork struck by eternity. Even the palm trees seem to breathe in rhythm with the temples behind them. And somewhere, perhaps in the house of a fisherman, perhaps in a scholar's dream, another family sleeps. Not ancient, not modern, just human. Their walls may be cement now instead of clay, but the pattern remains. One lamp, one blanket, one shared warmth. The cat has not changed, nor has the sound of the river. The Nile still hums its lullaby in the same low key. They too are part of the same chain of breath stretching backward 5,000 years. Every sleeper in Egypt belongs to a single unbroken conversation between body and earth, a rhythm so patient that even death cannot interrupt it for long. If you walked the banks of the Nile at this hour, you would see small lamps floating on its surface, offerings for the departed, prayers for the living. Each flame flickers once, twice, then steadies. The river carries them downstream, tiny suns riding a dark mirror. They go out one by one, but their reflections remain for miles. That is Egypt's secret again: disappearance without loss. The gods understood it. The peasants lived it. The land enforced it. Even the language carried it: words balanced between opposites, hieroglyphs pairing light with dark, movement with stillness. The writing itself looked like architecture. Square, rhythmic, deliberate. Every sentence was a house built for thought. No wonder their stories have survived. They were constructed to breathe. If history were a body, Egypt would be its lungs. Inhale too much modern noise, and she exhales calm to even it out. You can feel that balance if you let her speak through the senses instead of through facts. Forget the timelines for a moment. Listen to the temperature. It tells the real story. Somewhere, perhaps in a tomb sealed for centuries, there is still a trapped pocket of air from a night like this one, air that once touched the cheek of a mason, brushed over a linen shroud, circled the curve of a lamp. If released, it would smell faintly of resin and river water, and it would still be cool. Imagine breathing that. In inhaling history at the temperature it preferred to be remembered. The thought alone is a kind of comfort, because what the Egyptians built was not only civilization but climate, moral, emotional, physical, a world calibrated to the possibility of peace. Even their humor reflected that moderation. One old proverb carved near a worker's hut reads, "If the sun is too hot, move your shadow." Practical, patient, and funny. The trinity of Egyptian philosophy. They didn't complicate wisdom. They practiced it until it became instinct. And still, the Nile flows. It has seen empires turn to rumor and cities turn to dust. It has watched gods retire gracefully into museums. But it continues with the same rhythm, because rhythm is stronger than rule. The water glints under the moon, whispering to the banks, "Balance, balance, balance." Perhaps that's why Egypt has always comforted the sleepless. There's something in its slow certainty that soothes modern chaos. You realize that rest isn't something you take, it's something you return to. The Egyptians knew this. Their architecture was a map back to calm. Tonight the desert is colder than memory, yet it doesn't threaten. It watches kindly, holding the ruins in its vast, unjealous arms. The sand may cover, but it never erases. It is simply another form of linen. Even the stars seem to tuck the land in, arranging their positions like stitches on a cosmic shroud. And the night hums with that old promise: warmth without fire, eternity without haste. Listen closely, and you can still hear the artisan somewhere beyond time. A hammer taps once, softly. A brush swishes pigment over plaster. A hand smooths the curve of a bed leg carved like a lion. They're still working, those ghosts, not to finish a tomb, but to maintain the balance of the world. Every touch, every echo of movement keeps Ma'at alive. When dawn finally creeps back, that slow, honey-colored dawn, it will not end this night so much as turn it over. The same light that once touched their faces will touch yours. The same river breath will cool your skin. You are, whether you admit it or not, sleeping in their architecture still. Because Egypt never really went anywhere. It just moved inside you. Every time you build for peace instead of power, every time you choose patience over control, you repeat its oldest prayer. You become, in miniature, another mud brick holding warmth for the next night. And when you finally sleep, really sleep, the world feels balanced again. The temperature steadies, the wind softens, the silence blooms. Somewhere, far down the river of history, a voice as old as the Nile itself murmurs, "You have learned the secret at last." Warmth is not a gift from fire. It is the kindness between things. The sound fades. The stars pulse once more, as if nodding in agreement. And Egypt, amused and eternal, rolls over in her great stone bed and dreams on of balance, of breath, of you. The first light comes quietly in Egypt. It doesn't crash over the horizon like a storm of gold. It seeps, polite and deliberate, through the thin slits of windows cut into mud brick walls. The air that was cool only moments ago begins to warm, but not suddenly. The transition, like all things Egyptian, is graceful, a patient conversation between night and day, shadow and stone. Inside a single-room house near the river, a child stirs. Her eyes open not to alarm, but to a gentle hum, her mother's voice, low and steady, repeating an old prayer. We wake with Ra, and our limbs are his rays. Outside, the sky shifts from blue-gray to pale honey. The same light that gilded the pharaoh's temples now slides across the family's modest walls. There is no difference in the way it blesses. One by one, they rise. The father stretches, his joints popping softly in the hush. He rolls the mat, folds the linen, dusts a few stray husks of grain from the floor. Each gesture is small, but sacred, the kind of reverence that needs no temple. Egyptians didn't separate housework from holiness. They were the same act of keeping order, of maintaining ma'at, the cosmic balance that governed everything from the stars to the shape of a bed. The mother moves quietly, sweeping the floor with palm fronds tied into a fan. The sound, a soft rhythmic rustle, joins the murmurs of the waking village. Other families are stirring now too, their movements synchronized without planning. The sound of clay pots clinking, the splash of water poured into basins, the occasional laughter of children catching the morning's first mischief together. They form the music of renewal. In this hour, the house inverts its role. What had been a cocoon of warmth now becomes a refuge of shade. The same thick walls that kept the night's chill outside will soon repel the day's burning heat. The Egyptians designed for reversal walls that remembered the day's warmth just long enough to comfort the night, then forgot it in time to protect the morning. Balance in brick form, architecture with a moral compass. The father takes a clay jar filled with water, cooled overnight, and pours it slowly over his hands, then over his face. The shock of it wakes the blood. There's no soap, only the faint scent of natron, a crystalline salt from the desert, used for both washing and eternity. He rubs his hands together until they shine faintly in the growing light. The water trickles down to the earthen floor, darkening it in shapes that look briefly like hieroglyphs before fading. His wife follows suit, cupping her palms to sip the last of the cool water. It tastes of clay and sky. For her, this is not hygiene, but gratitude, a daily rebirth. Each morning was, in Egyptian belief, the small-scale version of creation itself. To open one's eyes was to mirror the universe's awakening. The world was new again, and everything deserved care. Their daughter laughs softly as she mimics them, splashing too much water on the floor. Her father pretends to scold her but grins all the same. Even the gods, he knows, would forgive joy before sunrise. It's said that the laughter of a child at dawn was a charm against misfortune, and who could argue with that logic? Breakfast is simple. Bread baked the day before, still soft from being wrapped overnight in cloth. A few dates, maybe a cup of beer so light it tastes more like grain tea. The mother places a small piece of bread beside the household shrine, a carved niche in the wall, with painted lotus flowers and a faint inscription. Give us the dawn again. Keep us warm until the light. Agam. That's all it says, but it's enough. The prayer is older than memory. and as relevant now as it was 4,000 years ago. The Egyptians didn't rush their mornings. They believed that to move too quickly after sleep was to disturb the spirit before it had fully returned. The soul, the Ba, was thought to wander in dreams, visiting gods, ancestors, or perhaps only its own imagination. It needed time to settle back into the body, to adjust to flesh and gravity again. And so, mornings were slow, quiet talk, deliberate motions, long stretches of silence between breaths. Patience was not a virtue, it was survival. You can almost see it. The sunlight spreading across the mud brick walls like spilled honey. The dust motes swirling like gold flecks in air that smells of bread, smoke, and river. Outside, roosters crow, dogs stretch, donkeys bray half-heartedly. The Nile glints in the distance silver at first, then gold, then white as the sun climbs. It's the same sun that has risen over this valley every day for 5,000 years, utterly unimpressed by empire or ruin. And yet, in its light, everything glows anew. The family's morning is a quiet triumph, the successful completion of another cycle of balance. The night's cold has passed. The day's heat will come. Both are welcome, both necessary. No one thanks fire for warmth because fire was never needed. The warmth came from understanding. The Egyptians had no word for comfort that meant laziness. Their idea of comfort was harmony, a state in which nothing fought its nature. The wall did its job. The mat did its job. The body did its job. Even the gods, in their celestial bureaucracy, performed tasks of balance rather than indulgence. If a single force, heat, wind, hunger, greed, grew too strong, Ma'at tilted, and the world trembled. So each morning was a rehearsal for balance restored. In this way, Egypt never truly woke up, it simply shifted rhythms. The slow breathing of the night became the measured pulse of day. Farmers walked to the fields. Scribes opened scrolls. Potters turned their wheels. The artisans of Deir el-Medina packed their chisels, their brushes, their lunch of onions and flatbread, and began the quiet march toward the Valley of the Kings. Behind them, their wives tidied the beds and swept the floors. Everything had its ritual, and the ritual was warmth, the warmth of knowing one's place in the pattern. In a world without clocks, time was measured by temperature and light. The shade shortened, the walls brightened, the air thickened with the smell of baking clay. The same houses that had glowed faintly with oil lamps hours before now gleamed in sunlight, their interiors cool and dim. The architecture had inverted itself perfectly. Warmth turned to shelter, night to day, stillness to motion. Even their homes, it seemed, practiced discipline. By mid-morning, the Nile was awake, 2 boats gliding along its surface, oars dipping rhythmically. Fishermen called to each other across the water, their voices carried by the same breeze that once rustled reeds around sleeping mats. Every motion was connected to the last. Night fed day, rest fed labor, silence fed song. This was the Egyptian secret, and it still hums beneath the ruins. When you stand among those ruins today under the slanting sun that burns through the silence, you can feel that old intelligence pressing up through the sand, a kind of serenity that doesn't need to explain itself. They mastered not abundance but restraint, not fire but faith, not invention but rhythm. Other civilizations left us grander technologies. Mesopotamia gave us writing. Greece gave us philosophy. Rome gave us roads. But Egypt gave us something quieter, the blueprint for peace with the world. how to live without waging war on the elements, how to find warmth in patience, how to trust that the earth knows what it's doing. They understood what we've mostly forgotten, that comfort is not an act of domination, but of participation. To sleep through the desert cold without a single spark of flame was not a weakness. It was proof that harmony is stronger than control. Their world was never designed for excess. The mud brick wall, the papyrus mat, the linen sheet, the palm frond broom, each was humble, recyclable, perfectly efficient. Egyptians believed beauty was the residue of usefulness. Nothing purely decorative survived for long, because beauty had to work as hard as the people who made it. Even the gods were functional. They weren't distant creators, but daily participants. Ra drove the sun. Khnum shaped the Nile's flood. Hathor soothed with music. Bes guarded the bed. Taret guarded the womb. Divinity was labor that never ended, just as life was worship that never stopped. So when the family kneels briefly before the shrine after breakfast, it isn't ceremony. It's gratitude for being part of that circulation. The father whispers a few words about work. The mother murmurs thanks for health. The child hums something about the cat. The gods require no incense. They're satisfied with sincerity. Outside, the first heat of the day begins to press. The mother shades her eyes and watches the fields shimmer. In a few hours, the world will be bright enough to hurt. But for now, the air still holds that in-between temperature, the exact balance the Egyptians loved. It's the kind of warmth that doesn't demand anything, that just exists, like breath, like memory, like love. If you listen carefully, you'll hear a faint hum, not from machines, not from crowds, but from the earth itself adjusting. It's the same hum that filled the night when the walls exhaled warmth and the family exhaled dreams. Now it reverses direction. Warmth moves inward, darkness retreats, balance reasserts itself. The cycle continues. It always will. Even after all these millennia, Egypt still performs this miracle daily, the seamless transformation of light into life, of temperature into philosophy. The modern visitor feels it without realizing why. The strange calm that settles when you stand in the shadow of an ancient wall. The way the air feels alive but not intrusive. That's not nostalgia. That's design. The mud still remembers what it was taught. The philosophers of later empires talked endlessly about virtue. The Egyptians simply built it. In their hands, morality was architectural. A wall that holds both coolness and heat at the right times is a moral wall. A home that shelters equally from cold and sun is an ethical act. Balance was their religion, and it worked. The sun now climbs higher, dissolving the last traces of shadow. Across the river, temple columns catch fire not of flame, but of light. The palm trees shimmer. The air smells faintly of dates, dust, and baked bread. The world is once again a kiln, but inside the houses, peace remains. Coolness flows where warmth once did. The day has inherited the night's intelligence. You can almost see the invisible pattern the Egyptians wove into their lives. The rhythm between effort and rest, between heat and cool, between silence and song. It's the same rhythm that keeps the planet itself alive. Every civilization since has tried to outshine the sun. Egypt learned to walk beside it. Their final lesson then is simple. True warmth is not a temperature, but a relationship. It comes from rhythm, from proximity, from design, from walls that breathe, from linen that remembers, from bodies that share their heat without shame, from faith that doesn't demand proof. To be warm is to be in tune. To be in tune is to be alive. And so the morning continues. The father is gone to the fields now, his shadow long on the path. The mother hums as she grinds grain, the sound rising and falling with the rhythm of the pestle. The child plays near the doorway, drawing wobbly shapes in the dust with a stick, perhaps a sun, perhaps a river, perhaps just the beginning of a story. Everything ordinary, everything sacred. The sunlight climbs the wall, touching the painted eye of Horus by the shrine. It gleams briefly, then fades as the room brightens. Outside, the Nile glints like a blade of glass, vast, calm, eternal. Its surface holds the reflection of everything that has ever mattered. Walls, reeds, sky, and the faces of those who trusted it. Egypt's wisdom endures not in monuments, but in moments like this, a family waking, a mat being folded, a sweep of sunlight over clay. It is peace through balance, not fire. Serenity through understanding, not conquest. Warmth through belonging, not possession. And perhaps that is why, after all these centuries, Egypt still feels alive. Because it never truly burned, it only glowed. Because every breath of its wind, every curve of its wall, every flicker of its river still whispers the same truth. Peace is not silence. Warmth is not flame. And balance is the only immortality worth having. The light softens, and the world settles into its steady hum again. The night has gone, but its calm remains. The Nile moves impatient, glittering, wise. The family's laughter drifts across the courtyard, mingling with the rustle of reeds. The day has begun, and Egypt, as always, remembers how to be warm without fire.